Carlos Eduardo is a professor of architecture in the School of Architecture of Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil, at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. He is currently responsible for a design studio in the school. Carlos Eduardo was one of the founders of the postgraduate program in architecture in that university, a program which he directed for many years. He also leads a small but very active architectural practice in Porto Alegre, and has played in the last few years a very important role, has made a very important contribution to the ongoing debate on Brazilian modern architecture and urbanism, a subject on which Carlos Eduardo has been doing research for over a decade now, and on which he has lectured and published extensively both in Brazil and abroad. In fact, last time Comas was at the Architectural Association was in 1988, last time he lectured in the school, invited by the then chairman Alvin Boyarsky to give a couple of talks on a research project that he was doing at the time on Brazilian modernism, and in particular with reference to the work of Niemeyer. Today, Carlos Eduardo is going to be concentrating on the work of Lúcio Costa, and in particular the two projects that are the object of the exhibition he helped to set up, which is currently in view in the school. We'll be looking at the Ministry of Education and the Brazilian Pavilion at the New York World's Fair of '39, and in particular exploring the relationship between those projects and their urban context. Carlos Eduardo.
Thanks, George, for the introduction. I'd like to thank Moisen for the invitation, and I'd like to thank Linda Brown, Belinda Flaherty, Pamela Johnston, and Elizabeth, Andrew Mackenzie, and all the people that helped me to put up the show in the front room. Actually, this is a lecture of the, well, you have seen the movie, now read the book Variety. I do want to share with you some comments on both buildings on show, the Ministry of Education building and the Brazilian Pavilion at the New York World's Fair. And the title of this lecture is Modern Architecture, Brazilian Corollary. And as you will remember, Brazilian Corollary is the title that Le Corbusier gave to the last chapter of Precision, which was the book where he registered the impressions of his first Latin American sojourn. And I think that in hindsight, both the ministry, which was built in a 9-year period from 36 to 45, and the Brazilian Pavilion at New York, that was designed and built from 38 to 39, they turn into prophecy this title. Those are the first of the exemplary projects built by Lúcio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer in a 15-year period. They are the cornerstones of a Brazilian style of modern architecture, explicitly indebted to the Corbusier era, but in many ways so unlike it. Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a corollary is a proposition appended to one already demonstrated, as self-evident inference from it, an immediate deduction, a result. Costa had already written in '34 that Le Corbusier was the Brunelleschi of the 20th century, the man who had condensed modern architecture in 5 points, 4 compositions, and 2 additional elements: free plan, free facade, pilotis, roof garden, horizontal windows, picturesque play of volumes, or spiritual pure prisms, subtractively manipulated, pan de verre, and sunbreakers provided architects all over the world with an authoritative vocabulary and syntax. Originality in architecture was not of the essence for Lúcio Costa. He did not think it was a sin, but definitely it was not a recommendation. Nevertheless, he did seem to believe that one should strive to do better what others did well, as Julien Gadet of Beaux-Arts fame had once said. And both Costa and Niemeyer had been academically trained at Rio's National School of Fine Arts, founded as National Academy of Fine Arts by the Prix de Rome Grandjean de Montigny as early as 1817. Costa modestly presents the final solution of the ministry as a corollary of Corbusian studies, Corbusier having acted as consultant to the design for a month. I think that a closer scrutiny suggests a more ambitious endeavor, a labored correction of the master in the name of site and program, guided by full understanding of his compositional setup. I'd like to turn the lights off and okay. What you have to your right is the well-known plate of Corbusier's for compositions, and to your right you have the agache plan for Rio de Janeiro, done in 27, and you can see the site. The site of the ministry is 2 blocks away from this avenue, which is Rio downtown's main thoroughfare, and 4 blocks away from the sea. All this half circle being proposed landfill. The design process of the ministry includes 4 compositions. First and last by the Brazilian team led by Costa, second and third by Le Corbusier. And all involve, as you can see on your left, a multi-story office block connected to an auditorium of contrasting shape and to a hall or exhibit gallery of contrasting height. The generic rationale is the distinction between the architectural volumes or compositional elements that contain repetitive programmatic elements and those that serve special functions. A Beaux-Arts rooted ploy already used in the Army of Salvation building or in the Swiss Pavilion. 3 of those schemes use the Castello site, the one I showed you in the agache plan earlier, which was a whole block 200 meters away from downtown's main thoroughfare, which is called Avenida Rio Branco, and 400 meters away from the Avenida Beira-Mar. And the second of the series, Le Corbusier's first one, was to stand on a site between the Beira-Mar and the Guanabara Bay. Le Corbusier was always eager, and he had been invited, to judge on the Brazilian's first theme, but he was never contented, so he had to find an alternative site that ultimately proved to be unavailable. And I think that were it not for that reason, actually Corbusier could have really, designed the ministry. Anyway, you can see that the wedge-like casing of the auditorium and the orthogonal configuration of hall or gallery remain the same in all cases. And they share the same the same longitudinal axis with an intermediary vestibule beneath the office block in all studies but Corb's sketch for the Castello site, where they succeed each other on line along the east-west street to the south. The office block changes from a bent prism in the first study to prisms juxtaposed in the Corbusian proposals and to pure prism in the final solution. The lower, 2 stories high volumes are centrally disposed in the initial study, slightly off-center in the Beira-Mar project, laterally placed in the final solution. In Corb's Castello proposal, they integrate a single mass perpendicular to the office block that occupies the north-south avenue to the west. The initial partie is U-shaped, mostly symmetrical, and rather Versaillesque in flavor. The corps de logis is placed on the transverse axis of the site, wings aligned with the bordering north-south thoroughfares. A cruciform layer is superimposed on the courtyard format. The entrance hall would stick out of the corps de logis as a focal accent within the courtyard's enclosure. The protruding gallery would dominate the opposite plaza to the south. As for Corb's Beira-Mar study, it eschews Versailles and looks towards Brera. The intersection idea becomes overwhelming, even though strict centrality is abandoned. No courtyard would contain the entrance ritual. Penetration would develop laterally beneath the open pilotis in either extremity of the office block. The ministry would be read as a freestanding, never to be shadowed beacon on the shoreline. The partie is L-shaped in Corb's rather crude Castello sketch. The main block and the lower volumes define a single plaza, oriented towards a sector of the Castello area that was undeveloped at that moment. In the final solution, the office block grows taller and is placed on the transverse axis of the site like the corps de logis of the initial study. And thanks to the lateral disposition of the aisles that give access to the auditorium, gallery and auditorium seem to integrate a single lower block, a parallelepiped cleft and deformed by the wedge that cupped one of its extremities. Gallery and auditorium are placed on the second floor and the ground devoted to service. The partie is now T-shaped. The encased auditorium takes the place of the eastern wing of the earlier study. The gallery suggests a mirroring of that wing, and two plazas are oriented towards the Rio Branco Avenue and integrated by the pilotis beneath the office block. So internalization of the two service cores required by the program generates a pure prism with blank side walls and glazed southern and northern facades, the latter shielded by screen of mobile sunbreakers. Part of the pilotis becomes a portico, sheltering the lateral access to the entrance beneath the western end of the office prism. Height of the pilotis is increased from 4 to 10 meters so that its cylindrical columns look slender. In order to comply with the pilotis, the external colonnade of the lower block is brought to the front of its intermediary slab, a latter-day version of a colossal order that transforms a Corbusier vignette, a vignette that was already present in Corb's study for the Beira-Mar Avenue, into a full-grown motif. Restaurants, reservoir, and machine rooms stand in the roof garden. Opaque surfaces are clad in granite and azulejos, following Corb's advice. Corbusier dismissed the Costa team's initial study as stiff, and right he was. But Costa's criticisms of Corbusier's sketch for the Castello site are also to the point. Unfavorable orientation of working spaces with loss of the view of the bay. Closeness to the adjacent aligned buildings shaped by the Agacho plan of 27. It was not clearly differentiated from them and disregarded, on the other hand, the relative hierarchy of the surrounding streets, the west-east direction of the main pedestrian flows accessing the site. That is why the Brazilians align the lower block with the narrower, less important street to the east and open the plazas to the Rio Branco Avenue, defining a secondary or service elevation and a formal facade, a back, and a front. Last but not least, the pure prism allows a maximal contrast with the adjacent perimeteral blocks. The exceptional element is pitted against the ordinary fabric. The scheme is tied to the site and cannot be properly understood without taking it into account. The shortcomings of Corb's Castello sketch are not present in the Beira-Mar study, and the Brazilians could very well have lifted his proposal out of the Beira-Mar site and stuck it to the Castello site. It would have worked quite well indeed. Yet the Costa team went back to the drafting table and devised a project that is the very antithesis of the Beira-Mar study in a crucial aspect. Corp's pilotis is a void, solid void affair, potentially extensible. Corp's base is cruciform. The base worked out by the Costa team is finite, a solid void solid scheme. The extremities of its pilotis merging with or backing up the walls of the two vestibules. The central section metamorphosed into a quite impressive hypostyle hall. Gallery and auditorium confine movement and space. Actually, both schemes are peripheric compositions in the Colin Rose sense. The neutrality of section brought about by the use of repetitive flat slabs displacing interest from center to extremity. Both adhere to the notion of architecture as debate between walls and columns, axiality and dispersion of focal points, centrality and dispersion and peripherization of anchors, frontal presentation and oblique or circular routes. Nevertheless, the strategies employed differ. Corbusier blocks the center and specifies a rotary movement. The Brazilians vacate the center and get by with a binuclear scheme, as in the Bauhaus, a few refinements added. Actually, there is something with the slides. They are not. No, they are not responding in the order, I think. Let me see. I might. How should I? How do I do in order? Reverse. Yeah, I found it. Okay. Well, it's not very noticeable, but it's quite important that on the north and south sides of the employees' entrance lobby, there are the planted bands of vegetation that parallel the lower block and flank the granite paved esplanade that runs across the central portico. And what was at first sight a T-shaped partie is now deployed conceptually and experientially as a H-shaped arrangement, as if the original scheme had been duplicated along the longitudinal axis of the taller block and virtually expanded. The base of the building now covers the whole site, and a hide-and-seek game is installed. Entrances are not disclosed by frontal approaches. The eye is stopped by solid walls, or defeated by holes that lead it away from the building. The planted bands are almost as impenetrable as the service facade, and the central portico is hollow. And it's only the corner views that give reliable clues to the building's anatomy and physiology. Acknowledgement of the site's connection with the urban structure of Rio's downtown warrants the elaborate choreography of the promenade architecturale leading to the building. And there is food for thought along the way. As said before, the portico can be quite aptly described as a hypostyle hall, akin to the Theban temple that Choisy illustrated and Corbusier reproduced in Vers une architecture. There are no capitals incised with palm leaves in the ministry columns. Nevertheless, their stock geometry does recall the trunks of those imperial palm trees that so captivated the French master during his Rio sojourn. Architecture is shown as mineralized vegetation, a second and man-created nature in the image and likeness of the original one. And the absent wing introduces a twist in the argument, vegetation as embryonary or taken over architecture. Architecture and nature suggests to be interchangeable, since both can be used to differentiate space and to shape places. Those ideas are not really new. Yet here, they do insinuate the need for a formal relationship capable of bypassing classical or picturesque precedents. The exact role that Boulamarx, the landscape architect, played in the ministry design is unknown, but the counterpoint between modern architecture and garden design that he initiated in this instance remains unmatched. The portico's transverse axis falls within the space among columns, observing accepted conventions. The longitudinal axis falls within a row of columns in deliberate transgression of the fusion of movement and design axis that was customary in Beaux-Arts prairies or in classical prairies. There is axiality of conception and a centralized access. But in order to get into the entrance halls, the body has to turn and negotiate rather small side doors. The main vestibule is an anticlimax, appearing low and dark despite its yellow and beige marbles. The information booth propels the visitor diagonally to the anteroom, where a glass brick wall deflects traffic to the lifts on the left wall and a circular staircase on the right. The huge staircase is centrally disposed but obliquely approached as the spiral route proceeds. The glazed passages that connect auditorium and gallery come into view. The body needs to keep turning to enter an aisle of the tripartite gallery space, whose central nave is prevented from any dominant role by the combination of staircase placement and flat ceiling. Rotary movement along the walls leads the visitor to the auditorium, and as he completes the ceremonial circuit and takes his seat, axis of symmetry and the focal point converge at last, and repose is assured. And I don't have the slide of the auditorium, which is on show at the front room. And if you were to visit the typical floor of the ministry, you would find a 4-meter high single volume partitioned by wooden panels 2 meters high. And in the roof garden, you would find 2 restaurants that somehow follow the same binuclear scheme of the ground floor. Well, pride might have compelled the Brazilians to reject Corbus's Beira-Mar project. It acknowledged their first effort, but implied it was amateurish. Maybe they needed to show that they were not so dumb after all. Maybe pride and doubt merged. And Costa and company remaining less than convinced by a proposal that in a sense could stand anywhere and was so clearly a prototype, the infinitely reproducible fragment of an utopian functional city. In fact, all respects paid to Corbusier, Costa insinuates that his seashore, come on, I was never good with buttons. Okay, I want to stay here. In fact, all respects paid to Le Corbusier, Costa insinuates that his seashore building is not monumental enough, and monumentality was of the essence also. The minister was adamant. He wanted an architectural portrait of the substance and goals of the institution under his control, an edifice conveying its seminal role in the construction of Brazilian nationality. Now, a monument can be conceived as a time-defying machine for remembering, one that publicizes and recalls ideas, peoples, events, beliefs that in a way are out of the commonplace and the ordinary. One that is often associated to rites whose formality or ceremony fall outside normal routines. A monument and a landmark are not exactly the same thing, but a building has to be a landmark to operate as a monument. It needs to be memorable itself. And memorability is facilitated by a certain degree of formal abstraction, by extraordinary size and scale, by a rather grave physiognomy, and extraordinary richness or ornamentation. Thus Costa's insistence on the pure prism, on durable materials, solid construction, and on a specially commissioned collection of artworks. Recognition of a monument is also facilitated by association with other monuments in the past. The azulejos of the ministry, the tiles of the ministry, are not the standard industrial type variety, but one-of-a-kind panels like those found in the Portuguese and Brazilian cloisters of the 17th century. The esplanade at the base does not relate to the green carpet required by the radiant or the functional city. It refers instead to the church pavilion or the palace cour d'honneur, archetypes of the sacred and the profane monument. The portico is not unlike a triumphal arch, and the colossal order brings to mind the Campidoglio. To be sure, all this is done in the guise of allusion, sometimes elusive, ambiguous, or subversive, but always warranted by the wish of, Comas, rendering sensible through material form the purposes of a building and the values they are associated with. In other words, characterization of the program is the name of the game, following design strategies codified ages ago by Quatremer de Cancy, the perpetual secretary of the French Academy, and paraphrased by Costa himself in the memoir of the University of Brazil project in '36. As the Beaux-Arts taught, correct composition in itself was not enough. A building had to be endowed with appropriate character by a rigid control of its geometry and materiality, by the manipulation of plan and elevation, the manipulation of masses and volumes, the selection of ornaments, the choice of building technology and materials. Procedures could be substantive, recalling proper precedents, whether in the overall scheme or in the detailed design, and Costa will justify the choice of some breakers over roller blinds, which were the common solution in Brazil at that time for blocking the sun in southern facades, by observing that roller blinds would give the ministry the air of a common apartment building. Procedures could be just as well be adjective, infusing the project with appropriate attributes. Thus, the externalized promenade and the hollow central portico speak also of the exuberance and porosity allowed by the climate. Gade having sensibly observed that the locational features might qualify the characterization of the program. In that light, the already old modern metaphor of the building as a ship takes here an added interest, for it aptly conveys the minister's institutional message and reinforces the proximity with the Guanabara Bay. Moreover, exuberance, porosity, and mobility could well be interpreted as signs of an open and cultivated temperament. However fictional that might have been, there is no doubt that the minister was pleased, having gotten both affirmation of a modernization grounded on tradition and affirmation of nationality within the context of the Western world. And the ministry survives to this day, and now it houses the Serviço do Patrimônio Histórico e Artístico Nacional, which would be, more or less equivalent to national heritage. Yeah? But our other friend, the Brazilian Pavilion at the New York World's Fair of '39, is long gone. It was designed in '38 by Costa and Niemeyer, and there are no qualms with Le Corbusier about authorship here. The site is a half block bordered by one of the main avenues of the fair. I think that slide is upside down. We can look at this. I was also never very good at those things. What the building is. Well, here is the Pavilion. Okay. Here is one of the main avenues to the fair. You have here a secondary street that divides the sector of corporate pavilions from the sector of national pavilions. And you have a pedestrian walk, and you have a street, and you have rolling fields. So this is the site. And according to Costa, in his memoir, it is the secondary winding street that suggested the adoption of the curving line as the leitmotif for the design. And he says that Ionic elegance replaces Doric severity in conformity with the mood of a World's Fair. So we have a lace-like partie, and this lace-like partie allows both differentiation from and integration with the blocky French pavilion in the neighboring plot. And the French pavilion was already in construction, and the Brazilians arrived in New York to do the design. From the intersection of avenue and street, this is an L-shaped and horizontally stratified affair on pilotis with a loosely arranged ground floor and a highly structured piano nobile. The piano nobile is connected to the ground through a curved ramp that occupies much of the building's forecourt. It leads to a half-covered loggia between the main gallery along the street and another wedge-shaped auditorium, whose longitudinal axis is parallel to the avenue. The oblique wall of the auditorium points to the gallery entrance, and its half-cylindrical ending is amplified by a curvilinear cut in the roof slab over the loggia. So you have strong contrasts and subtler textural play, opening up a rather close arrangement and enhancing the central loggia's focal quality. Porosity and exuberance are reiterated, and the reiteration assumes a new guise in the ground floor. The ground floor itself houses a coffee bar and a restaurant on the street side, an information booth at the corner, and more exhibition spaces behind the ramp. But its recessed peripheral columns are alternately exposed or hidden by curving screens. And this is a frank external disclosure of the free plan mechanisms that is not to be found in the work of Corbusier. It's always internalized in Le Corbusier, and is quite possibly the development of an insinuation made by Mies in a similar context, the Barcelona Pavilion. The suprematist look. Okay. The suprematist look of some of the interior exhibits adds to the stream of modern quotations, including the plausible association of the serpentine wing with Corbusier's megastructure project for Rio of '29. The central loggia allows sight to enjoy in sequence a courtyard filled with tropical aquatic plants, the stream bordering the plot, and the rolling fields fall away. The reference to the French Hotel Particulier is obvious. The prevailing duality is striking, and its most startling displayed manifests in the shift to transparent monumental garden facades that display a modern colossal order with added conviction, with renewed conviction. The implicit continuity of the street and avenue elevations is replaced by a crystal palace tenuously connected with the auditorium volume through a concave offspring of its roof, flying over and contrasting with the straight border of the loggia. Uncovered ediculae showing Brazilian flora and fauna are disposed in succession. Well, what happened? Okay, that's what I wanted. That was the one I wanted. The slide that you left. Anyway, uncovered edicula showing Brazilian flora and fauna are disposed in succession along the blank internal elevation of the neighboring pavilion, and they reinforce the courtyard partie, what was at first sight L-shaped now becomes U-shaped. They asymmetrically balance the gallery wing, and they corroborate the bias towards volumetric multiplication, which is another form of exuberance, and quite appropriately, theatricality reigns. And that is quite, I think, attuned to the fact that it is a first pavilion. The vestibule of the main gallery is rather sedate by comparison, a pause before embarking on the exhibit promenade. As the curtain opens, a mezzanine of irregular contours protrudes to conform two corridors in a central display area. The main route follows the glazed wall until the stairs and niches along the blank walls include the Chiricopy and a bow to Italian rationalism. And rather more important is the interplay between slabs and columns, a clever development of the domino principle. Domino was the iconic embodiment of the free plan principle, the graphic depiction of a normative structural condition, regularly spaced rows of columns supporting a series of parallel flat slabs. So domino is also a depiction of the fact that horizontality, orthogonality, and repetitivity are the attributes, the key attributes of the normative condition. Yet domino also shows that vertical accents can be introduced by punching out slabs, as you see in this staircase. that the basic columnar rhythm can be diversified, different cantilevers formulated, so that edges of different slabs may lack congruence. So Domino insinuates that modern architecture is not only independence between walls and structure, but between slabs, columns, and walls. It's not only about different configurations of walls on different levels, but about different configuration of slabs on different levels. Domino is a multiplanar construct open to a multiplicity of compositional possibilities, and so much seems to have been understood by Costa and Niemeyer. To end, urbanistically, both the ministry and the pavilion may be seen as forerunners of a contemporary figurative city, aptly described by Oriol Boigas as a city of streets that are almost corridors and blocks that are almost closed, yet able to sustain the traditional discrimination between fabric and monument. Architecturally, they are simultaneously conservative and radical, fooled by a thorough respect and understanding of disciplinary culture, explicitly relying on evolution rather than on revolution. Nevertheless, their emphasis on choice is not a denial of invention. In fact, they seem to proclaim that an architectural thesis' validity is also measured by the richness of the corollaries it may generate, and corollaries may not be so self-evident after all, their formulation requiring eyes that can see and brains that can think. If the forms of the ministry and pavilion may no longer be suited for wall replication nowadays, the concerns that inform their conception do not seem to have lost relevance. I hope you will agree with me, and I thank you for your attention.